Let's turn our attention to this now. President Cyril Ramaphosa will be joining the Secretary General, the President of the General Assembly, as well as the heads of state and government as the two-day summit of the future kicks off in the next hour at the United Nations out in New York. Now, the summit is expected to produce an intergovernmentally negotiated, action-orientated pact for the future, which chapters of sustainable development as well as financing for development, international peace and security, science and technology and innovation and digital cooperation, youth and future generations, as well as transforming global governance. And for that, we do have the latest with our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who is currently at the United Nations tracking those developments for us. Sherwin, a very good afternoon to you. So we are hearing that there are still some questions, of course, as to whether we will have an outcome document, the pact for the future that all member states have actually agreed to based on the consensus principle. So tell us more about that.
Well, that's the point, right? The consensus nature of documents and outcome political declarations that are adopted by heads of state and government at summits of this nature, Alicia, is driven by consensus. And what that means is everybody, all 193 member states, must essentially agree to a text that will be adopted. And the premise here is that heads of state and government will adopt it at the beginning of the opening session, which is moments away here in New York of the Summit of the Future. Let me just read you, Alicia, the opening lines of the Pact of the Future. We, the heads of state and government, representing the peoples of the world, have gathered at the United Nations headquarters to protect the needs and interests of present and future generations through the actions of this Pact of the Future. We are at a time of profound global transformation. We are confronted by rising catastrophic and existential risks, many caused by the choices we make. Fellow human beings are enduring terrible suffering. If we do not change course, we risk tipping into a future of persistent crisis and breakdown. So that really gives you a sense of what this pact is about. It is a recognition that the current system of multilateralism that undergirds the United Nations and institutions of a multilateral nature are not working in an efficient manner to meet the challenges of the day. Look at the SDGs. We are only at 17% of all the targets in the SDGs being implemented. When you look at financing for the SDGs, financing for development, financing for climate change, you do not have global financial institutions geared towards the needs that developing countries in particular might have. When you look at the international peace and security architecture, just think of the Security Council and how it struggles to reach consensus given the use of the veto on conflicts like Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, for example. And so this Pact of the Future is very much about addressing how the system works to meet the challenges of the day. It's a question I put to the Secretary General during his preview press conference last week. Listen to that exchange and come back to me right after. Watch. Take the summits that we've had in the past. For example, the 2018 summit that was a precursor to the UN General Assembly in 2018. It's called the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit. The declaration that heads of state and government adopted then said that we as heads of state and government commit to redouble our efforts to build a just, peaceful, prosperous, inclusive and fair world, revive the values for which Nelson Mandela stood by, placing human dignity at the center of our actions. We commit to demonstrating mutual respect, tolerance, understanding, reconciliation in our relations. I would argue that that declaration has not been implemented, similar to all the other declarations and pacts that we've seen heads of state and government adopt that are gathering dust on the ash heap of history. I don't understand the case you're making to say that this is now going to be the beginning of something new.
It's very simple. The SDG summit and the SDGs themselves and all the declarations you mentioned are about the what is needed. The Summit of the Future is about the how. The Summit of the Future takes into account the fact that to be able to implement the Agenda 2030, to be able to implement all the extraordinarily important declarations that you have mentioned, we need to have reformed institutions, because today's institutions are institutions that correspond to the world of the post-Second World War and are totally unable, they have proven to be, to address the challenges of today, and namely the challenges of developing countries. And the Summit of the Future is about the how, is about the reforms that are necessary in all areas: Security Council, Bretton Woods institutions, aspects related to artificial intelligence, to climate. I mean, in all those areas, there is a serious problem of governance. And it is about that governance that this summit is about. And that is new and essential.
So, Alicia, previous summits were about the what. This summit, the Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future, is about the how. And we'll see if they adopt. We're just moments away from the opening session here, and we'll see if there is broad consensus among the 193 member states to adopt the Pact of the Future. Just moments away, Alicia.
A very interesting exchange you had there with Guterres, of course, Sherwin, because President Cyril Ramaphosa also mentioned on his arrival in New York yesterday that, of course, the Africa region would be very, very focused on, of course, the issue of Security Council reform, as well as the language and the pact that the Secretary General has described as being the strongest in the generation. So how will then the summit inform the process of reforming the council, given the stakes that are at play here?
Yeah, despite the Secretary General's optimism about how strong the language is about the need for reform in this pact, let's also understand that there is a parallel process called the Intergovernmental Negotiations on Security Council reform that is being run under the auspices of the General Assembly that is parallel to this pact. That is a separate process that is underway that has now been years in the making, right? And we still have not reached text-based negotiations, which are fundamental for the final formulation that we will emerge with in terms of a reconfigured Security Council, right? We currently have 15 members, 5 vetoes. Are the vetoes going to stay? Is Africa going to get the 2 permanent seats it has wanted in terms of the Eswatini consensus, plus the veto? That seems unlikely. There is a different negotiation process in terms of that reform that is going on, despite anything that is contained in the Pact of the Future, which is a voluntary pact, which means voluntary implementation. The IGN process would be binding. But that is a separate process, and so the negotiations are still ongoing. So I wouldn't be too optimistic about what the pact says in terms of Security Council reform. We really need to focus on the IGN process that will deliver a final formulation in the years ahead. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
I know we touched on it a little bit yesterday, of course, Sherwin, during the arrival of the president alongside the ministers that are a part of his contingent to this particular UNGA. Talk to us maybe about what else is on the agenda for the president and his ministers this week.
Well, we're first and foremost certainly looking forward to his intervention at the summit. He's the 7th speaker after when the heads of state and government take to the floor later this morning here in New York, this afternoon, Alicia. But then tomorrow his program is going to be very much focused on South Africa, a national perspective in terms of investment and engagement with business leaders. He has a meeting, a roundtable navigating the new landscape in terms of this push for African minerals that are essential to the green transition, the renewable transition that we are all engaged in. He's meeting with something called the Business Council for International Understanding. Essentially, this is an NGO, a non-profit comprised of policy experts, strategic advisors, trade educators that are offering commercial diplomatic services. So it's going to be curious to listen to what that discussion is about. He will also visit the New York Stock Exchange on Monday, where he will engage further with investors and business leaders. And then, of course, the UN General Debate, where he will present the country statement on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, there is a key meeting, a high-level meeting of the G20. Remember, South Africa is the incoming chair of the G20. President Lula da Silva of Brazil will be at that high-level meeting. He is the incumbent, the current chair of the G20. And so really very much a focus on the financial health of the world economy, right? The G20's main purview is global economic stability, and we know just how difficult that has been for many, many developing countries emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic a few years ago. So a big economic focus for the president. I can also tell you there are a number of ministers, Alicia, in town, including the Minister in the Presidency for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, Maropene Ramakgopa. Parks Tau is here, the Trade and Industry and Competition Minister, Dr. Dion George, the Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. Of course, when you talk about sustainable development, climate change, a big factor. Just look at what South Africa is experiencing in terms of this extreme weather in September, right? That tells you a story. Aaron Motsoaledi is here, the Health Minister. There is a high-level meeting on pandemic preparedness. President Ramaphosa, Alicia, is also the chair of the Global Leaders Network on Women's, Children and Adolescent Health. He will be presenting their findings to a high-level meeting. And then, of course, Ronald Lamola, who we spoke to earlier this week, the International Relations and Communication and Cooperation Minister. So the President has a lot of support here. I also understand, actually, that Solly Malatsi, the Communications Minister, is also in town. He's attending a meeting called the UN Broadband Commission that looks at how to expand broadband, particularly in rural areas in developing countries. So lots to talk about in the days ahead, and certainly a strong South African contingent participating in discussions here in New York.
Very busy indeed. We'll certainly be keeping a track of all those developments. Thank you so much to our U.S. correspondent there, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, on, of course, the future summit that is currently getting underway on the sidelines of the UNGA.